Well, it's a family name that has ruled over Cuba for nearly 6 decades. The Castro regime is the island's revolutionary dynasty, known for overthrowing a military dictatorship, but also criticized for stifling economic and political freedoms. Today, though, that rule is coming to an end. Cuba's National Assembly is meeting to select a new president. Miguel Diaz-Canel is expected to be the first leader since the revolution without the Castro name. So what is next for Cuba without a Castro? For more on the man expected to be Cuba's new president, let's bring in Isaac Sani. He is the co-chair and national spokesperson for the Canadian network in Cuba. He joins us right now in Halifax. Isaac, thank you for joining us today. So as we say, decades here with a Castro in charge, but now we have a new man coming in. Tell us about the man expected to become president.
Well, Miguel Diaz-Canel has a reputation for competence, for integrity, and for being committed not only to preserving what are the social conquests of the Cuban Revolution, its independence, but also participating at the center of the updating of the Cuban economy. He grew up in Villa, which is a very important province, as an electronics engineer, served in various Cuban internationalist missions abroad, and is now taking on, served as Minister of Higher Education, and will now be taking on possibly one of the most important posts, that is obviously the most important post he's ever held, which will be President of the Council of State. Today, or tomorrow, the 605 members of Cuba's elected National Assembly will choose the 23 members of the Council of State, 5 vice presidents, the first vice president, and the new president of Cuba.
The new president of Cuba, although interesting to note that Raul Castro will stay essentially as Secretary of the Communist Party until 2021. So what type of power will this president actually have if a Castro is still part of the greater regime?
Well, I think there's always been collective leadership in Cuba, even under Fidel Castro. People often failed to see the institutionalization of the Cuban Revolution because Fidel Castro was such a larger-than-life figure. He transcended the island. But there's always been collective leadership in Cuba. And Raul Castro carries not only the moral authority of his long service in Cuba, but also being member of the historic generation that made the revolution. So what we're witnessing is what is obviously an inevitable reality, is the handing over of the baton of revolutionary politics from the generation that made the revolution to the generations that were born during and within the Cuban Revolution. So Canel will have a significant amount of authority and a significant amount of input within a collective leadership process.
So significant impact. Will that mean changes for the Cuban people? Does that mean changes with the international community?
Well, I think an important thing to bear in mind is there's a significant consensus throughout Cuba to preserve Cuba's independence, which was won. They would argue in 1959, I think that's a very strong case, and also preserve what is a system that has received praise in terms of education, healthcare, social security, and protecting human dignity across the world in various United Nations and other international organization documents. But of course, Cuba is looking to the international climate, and many of us are always wary of what the Trump regime in the United States will do. It's very unpredictable. And since the opening of relations, the move towards what we call the formalization of diplomatic relations and the lessening of tensions between Cuba and the United States that were initiated under the former President Obama, since Trump has rolled back many of those measures, people are quite concerned that we're returning possibly to a hyper-aggressive United States policy against Cuba. So Cubans are very concerned about this, and as many people across the world are, and of course we'll be looking towards what will be happening from Washington.
And what about political freedoms internally, though? You're talking about mainly international relations, but as we said right off top, one of the greatest criticisms of the Castro regime has been a clampdown on political freedoms. Will that change with this generational change that you're talking about?
Well, the Cubans have always said that a major condition of Cuba's existence has been the U.S. economic hostility, and not only economic hostility, it's included a U.S.-sponsored invasion and various subversion campaigns. Cubans are wedded to the idea of national independence, and they often argue that the Cuban Revolution began not in 1959 or not in 1953 when the Moncada attack took place, but goes back to these independence struggles in the 19th century. So Cubans are very much historically and in present contemporary terms, wedded to this idea of independence and wedded to this idea of preserving the kind of social conquest they have gained. As I mentioned, the universal health care, the education, social security, and a country that's widely recognized as the safest country in Latin America and the Caribbean. So they believe in the idea of self-determination, and they won't have that dictated to them by external powers. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. As long as U.S. hostility maintains, Cuba will do all its best to maintain its independence and its social conquest.
Isaac, thank you for that. That's Isaac Sani, co-chair and national spokesperson for the Canadian Network on Cuba. He joins us in Halifax. And we do have more on this story that you can read online for more details on what Miguel Diaz-Canel is expected to face in this new monumental role. Just head over to CBCNews.ca and follow the links.